The War of the Worlds, a closer look. In 2025, Surrey History Centre was presented with 2 volumes of Pearson's magazine, covering the year 1897. These books contain the first serialisation of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This story, as well as the illustrations that accompany it, went on to influence the creation of the fledgling genre of science fiction and have continued to have relevance to this day. The War of the Worlds. In April 1897, a new serialisation appeared in Pearson's magazine. It was written by up-and-coming writer H.G. Wells. The War of the Worlds was Wells's 3rd novel in as many years, and after the wild success of The Time Machine in 1895 and The Island of Dr. Moreau the following year, this latest scientific romance was also to take the world by storm. The War of the Worlds reads as a journalistic description of the invasion of Earth by deadly Martians, in the style of Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year of 1722. We follow the unnamed narrator as he witnesses the mysterious firing of the rockets on Mars that send the Martians to Earth, the landing of the first cylinder, and the massacring of the people gathered to witness it with a devastating heat ray. He then goes on to describe how the Martians move through Surrey, destroying as they go, on their way to London and the coast, before being destroyed themselves by the humblest thing that God has put upon this earth: bacteria. Wells's journalistic style of writing would prove notoriously effective. On Halloween in 1938, Orson Welles read out a modified version of The War of the Worlds in an American radio broadcast that moved the scene of action from Surrey to New Jersey. So realistic was the reporting that the emergency services reportedly received thousands of panicked phone calls about an alien invasion. Wells had extraordinary attention to detail. Almost every place and landmark in the tale is depicted accurately to life, adding an extra level of plausibility to the story. In his Experiment in Autobiography, Wells noted that he used to cycle around Woking, marking down suitable places and people for destruction by my Martians. The War of the Worlds was a scientific romance, soon to be renamed science fiction, a genre in which Wells was a pioneer. The late Victorian period was one of great scientific advancements, and the Victorian public were both enthralled by the opportunities afforded by scientific exploration, but also fearful of the possible consequences. The War of the Worlds remains an interesting case in scientific romance, especially of the period, in that it inverts the usual danger found in science of pushing the boundaries too far, and instead highlights humanity's lack of knowledge and resources when compared to a more advanced species. In writing The War of the Worlds, Wells added a whole new subgenre to the fledgling science fiction genre, invasion from space. This work cleverly played on the popularity of the relatively new invasion genre. Books such as G.T. Chesney's The Battle of Dorking of 1871, which is about an invasion from Germany, were all the rage with a paranoid Victorian audience. The War of the Worlds takes the general theme of invasion and elevates the terror level by making the enemy into the unknown. It also enabled him to make the enemy all but invincible. Wells was writing for an increasingly better educated populace, keenly aware of global events and of Britain's place within the world. By directly comparing the invading Martians to the British explorers of earlier in the century, and likening the genocide threatened by the invaders to those carried out by the British and other European imperialists, he created an inevitability about humanity's demise that added to the terror. In so doing, he also forced readers to face their own hypocrisy, shining a devastating light on the British Empire. Pearson's magazine. Serialisation was a popular and common method of releasing and publicising novels. The Voyage of Copley Banks by Arthur Conan Doyle and Captains Courageous by Rudyard Kipling both appear in Pearson's at the same time as The War of the Worlds. The story was released a few chapters at a time in the monthly magazine, with each extract usually ending on a cliffhanger to entice the readers to buy the next edition. The first instalment, in April 1897, ended with the Martians appearing from within the cylinder and terror descending on the viewers, with a suggestion, a faint shriek, that the arrival of the Martians is something to be feared. The May edition starts with a summary of the previous edition. The first indication of the invasion of the Earth by the inhabitants of Mars is the falling of a cylinder on the common between Horsell, Ottershaw and Woking. Many persons, including the narrator of the story, go to inspect the cylinder. They notice that it is being very slowly unscrewed from the inside. At length, the top comes off, and a fearful-looking monster emerges, and then another. Everyone beats a hasty retreat. The later novelisation of the story, in 1898, allowed Wells to change many aspects of the original. The book form contains an extra chapter and a more in-depth analysis of the moral implications of invasion and colonisation. Illustrations. The illustrations for The War of the Worlds were undertaken by Cosmo Rowe and Warwick Goble in conjunction with Swain Studios. The serialisation is opened in dramatic style by Cosmo Rowe, with a terrified horseman fleeing an almost invisible heat ray. We are enabled to see the machine that is creating the ray. The imagining of the monsters is left to Warwick Goble. Goble's illustrations replicate the journalistic style of Wells's writing, rather than leaning into the sensational as some other illustrators do. The clothing and landscapes depicted reflect the real world, as though it was being reported in a newspaper rather than a fictional story. The mixture of mundanity, futuristic devices, and Gothic horror was a potent mix that kept audiences enthralled and terrified. As we progress through the story, the title headings become more dramatic, reflecting the devastation that the Martians have brought with them. As the mystery of the aliens becomes submerged beneath the relentless slaughter, we return from science fiction to classic Victorian Gothic horror, with the final illustration showing the narrator being haunted by a wall of ghouls, with the Martians reduced to a shadowy figure in the background. Wells was introducing completely new ideas to people that would have been very difficult to visualise. Goble had to try to imagine something never before seen, and the illustrations he produced were just as groundbreaking as Wells's words. Revolutionary as they were, Wells was originally unhappy with Goble's illustrations of the tripods. He thought Goble's tripods looked too stiff and almost comical. In the novelisation of the story, he added a paragraph explaining in the voice of the narrator that the original illustrations that readers may have seen in pamphlets at the time of the invasion were grossly inaccurate and were clearly rendered by someone who had never seen the creatures and was extrapolating from second-hand information. However, in later years, he softened his opinion and admitted that he thought that Goble had in fact done a good job.